I knew something was wrong the moment everyone stopped talking when I sat down. The restaurant was warm, softly lit, the kind of place where families celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where laughter usually floated between tables like music, but that night, it felt different, like I had walked into the final scene of a play I didn't know I was part of. I remember adjusting my napkin, smoothing it across my lap the way I always did, a small habit from years of hosting dinners in my own home, back when people still waited for me to sit before they began eating, and I noticed how no one reached for their glasses, no one smiled. Not even Daniel, my own son, who kept his eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder as if I were a stranger passing by. Ashley was the first to move, slowly, deliberately, her fingers wrapped around the edge of my plate, and for a second I thought she was helping, maybe clearing space, maybe fixing something I hadn't noticed, but then the sound came, sharp and sudden against the polished floor, louder than it should have been, loud enough to turn every head in the room, and just like that, everything became still. I didn't look down. I didn't need to. The silence told me enough. Someone at the next table gasped softly, a fork clinked against a glass, and the waiter who had just brought our drinks froze mid-step, unsure whether to approach or disappear. "Which?" Ashley said, not loudly, but clearly enough that it carried, her voice steady, almost practiced. "You should have never come." I felt the words more than I heard them, like a draft slipping through a closed window, subtle but impossible to ignore, and for a brief moment, I thought I might respond, that I might ask her what she meant, remind her that it was Daniel who had called me 2 nights ago, his voice unusually warm, insisting I join them, saying it had been too long, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I reached for my purse, placed it gently on my lap, and allowed myself a small, measured breath. I glanced around the table, at the untouched bread basket, the neatly folded menus, the glasses of water already beginning to sweat, and I realized then that this wasn't an accident, not a misunderstanding, not even a moment of anger that got out of control. It was arranged. Every look, every silence, every second of hesitation had been placed exactly where it needed to be. And strangely, that realization didn't break me. It steadied me. Because if this was planned, then so was everything I had done before walking through that door. I let my lips curve into a faint smile, the kind that confuses people, the kind that doesn't belong in moments like this, and I finally looked at Ashley, really looked at her, noticing the way she held her shoulders, the way she avoided my eyes now that her line had been delivered, as if the performance had already ended for her. But for me, it had just begun. I heard someone clear their throat behind me, the kind of quiet, uncertain sound people make when they do not know whether to step in or stay out of something that does not belong to them. And for a moment, I let that hesitation fill the space instead of words, because silence has a way of revealing more than any argument ever could. The waiter finally moved, carefully, as if approaching a fragile situation, and began to gather the broken pieces from the floor, his eyes lowered, respectful, but distant, as though he had already decided this was not his place to interfere, and I found myself grateful for that, because I did not need anyone to rescue me, not anymore. Daniel shifted in his seat, just slightly, the movement so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but I had spent a lifetime reading him, from the days he could not tie his own shoes to the moment he first walked out the front door with a suitcase and a promise to call more often, and I recognized that shift immediately. It was the same one he used when he wanted to disappear from responsibility, when he hoped that if he stayed quiet long enough, the moment would pass without requiring anything from him. I turned my gaze to him, not sharply, not accusingly, just long enough to give him the chance to meet my eyes, to say something, anything, that might remind me there was still a thread connecting us. But he did not look up, not once, and that was when the last piece settled into place for me. This was not just her doing. This was something he had allowed. I reached for my glass of water, took a small sip, and set it back down with care, noticing how steady my hand remained, how calm I felt in a moment that should have unraveled me. And it occurred to me that perhaps I had been preparing for this longer than I realized, that all those quiet observations over the past few years, the canceled visits, the conversations that ended too quickly, the polite smiles that never reached Ashley's eyes, they had not been random at all, they had been leading. Here, to this exact table, to this exact moment. Ashley let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, as if she had expected something more from me, a reaction, a raised voice, maybe even tears, and when none came, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, brief but unmistakable, like a crack in a carefully painted surface. "You should go," she added, a little louder this time, as though trying to regain control of a scene that was slipping away from her, and I nodded, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the way one might respond to a statement that no longer holds any power. I picked up my purse, smoothing the strap over my shoulder, and stood up from the table, feeling the eyes of the room follow me, not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of curiosity, as if they understood they had just witnessed something that did not quite make sense yet. And as I turned to leave, I allowed myself one final glance at Daniel, not expecting anything now, not hoping, just observing. And when he still did not look at me, I felt something inside me settle, not break, not shatter, but settle into a place of clarity I had not known before, a place where decisions had already been made, signatures already placed, and outcomes already set in motion long before a single plate touched the floor. I stepped out into the night air and felt the door close behind me with a softness that did not match what had just happened inside. And for a moment I stood there on the sidewalk, not moving, not rushing, just letting the quiet settle around me as cars passed and distant voices blended into a steady hum, the kind of ordinary world that continues no matter what breaks inside you. I adjusted my coat, smoothing the sleeve where a faint crease had formed, and began walking toward the parking lot, each step measured, steady, the way I had learned to move through difficult moments without drawing attention, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing me stumble. The pavement beneath my shoes felt familiar, grounding, and I found myself thinking not about what had just been said, but about everything that had led up to it. All the small details I had once dismissed, now returning with a clarity that felt almost precise, like numbers finally aligning after years of being slightly off. There was the time Ashley insisted on handling the holiday reservations, saying it would be easier if everything went through her, and how I had agreed, grateful to be included, only to arrive and find my name missing from the seating chart, brushed off as a simple mistake. There was the afternoon Daniel called to ask about documents, his tone careful, almost rehearsed, as if he were following instructions rather than speaking from his own thoughts, and how I had answered every question without hesitation, trusting that he needed help, not realizing I was giving away pieces of something much larger. And then there were the visits that grew shorter, the invitations that came later and later, until they felt less like invitations and more like afterthoughts, polite gestures that could be withdrawn without consequence. I reached my car and paused before unlocking it, my reflection faint in the window, older than I remembered, but not weaker, not diminished, just clearer, as though the years had finally sharpened something inside me instead of wearing it down. I opened the door and sat inside, placing my purse carefully on the passenger seat, the same purse I had carried earlier that day when I stopped by the office downtown. The one with the quiet hallway and the man who spoke in calm, measured sentences, explaining everything twice to make sure there was no confusion, no room for misinterpretation. I could still hear his voice, steady and patient, asking if I was certain, reminding me that once everything was signed and processed, there would be no easy way to reverse it. And I remembered how I had nodded without hesitation, because certainty had already taken root in me long before I sat in that chair. I turned the key in the ignition but did not start the engine right away, letting the silence of the car wrap around me like a final pause before something irreversible, and I realized that what happened inside that restaurant had not changed my course at all. It had only confirmed it, like a final signature on a document that had already been written. Somewhere behind me, the restaurant door opened again, voices spilling briefly into the night before fading, and I did not turn to look, because there was nothing left for me there. Nothing unfinished, nothing unresolved, only a chapter that had already closed the moment I chose to walk away without a word, knowing that by the time they understood what they had lost, it would no longer be mine to give. I finally started the engine and let it idle for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as the dashboard lights flickered on one by one, steady and predictable, unlike everything else that had unfolded that evening. And I found comfort in that small consistency, the quiet hum of a machine that did exactly what it was designed to do without hesitation or hidden intent. I pulled out of the parking lot slowly, careful and deliberate, the way I had always driven, never rushing, never needing to, because I had spent most of my life arriving early for things that mattered, setting tables before guests arrived, preparing rooms before anyone noticed they needed them. And somewhere along the way, I had assumed that effort would be remembered, that it would mean something in moments like this. But as the road stretched out ahead of me, lit by evenly spaced streetlights, I understood that memory, like respect, was something people chose to keep or discard depending on what served them best. The traffic was light, just a few cars moving steadily in the same direction, their headlights passing like quiet acknowledgments, and I drove without turning on the radio, without filling the space with noise, because I wanted to hear my own thoughts clearly, without interruption, without distraction. I thought about the office again, the neat desk, the careful arrangement of papers, the pen placed exactly where I would reach for it, and the way the man across from me had paused before sliding the final document forward, giving me time to reconsider, to ask questions, to hesitate. But I had not hesitated then, and I did not hesitate now. I had signed everything with a steady hand, each stroke of the pen clear and intentional, transferring ownership, updating beneficiaries, placing safeguards where there had once been open doors, and when it was done, he had looked at me with a kind of quiet respect, not sympathy, not pity, just acknowledgement, as if he understood that decisions like that were not made in a single moment, but built slowly over time, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to question. I stopped at a red light and watched as a couple crossed the street in front of me, their conversation animated, their hands moving as they spoke, unaware of anything beyond their own world, and I realized how easy it was to appear whole from the outside, how simple it was to look at a family and assume everything beneath the surface was intact, when in truth, it could already be unraveling in ways no one else could see. The light turned green, and I continued forward, the road leading me back to a house that felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had, and as I turned into my driveway, I noticed the porch light still on, just as I had left it, a small, steady glow waiting without expectation, without condition. I parked the car and sat there for a moment longer, looking at the front door, remembering all the times it had opened to welcome people in, to offer warmth, to create a space where everyone felt they belonged, and I wondered when that had stopped being enough, when generosity had started to look like weakness in someone else's eyes. I reached for my purse and took out the folded copy of the documents I had been given earlier that day, running my fingers along the edge of the paper without opening it, because I did not need to read it again to know what it contained. I had already memorized the outcome, already accepted the consequences, and as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, I felt no urgency, no doubt, only a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be decided by anyone sitting at that table tonight, because the moment they chose to push me out, they had also stepped beyond the reach of everything I had once been willing to give. I closed the front door behind me and stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the handle as the quiet of the house settled around me, deeper than the silence outside, more familiar, almost expectant, as if it had been waiting for me to return not with answers, but with a decision already made. I slipped off my shoes and placed them neatly by the door, the same way I had done for years, a small ritual that once meant I was home, that everything outside could be left behind. But tonight it felt different, not like an ending, but like a transition into something I had been moving toward without fully naming it. The living room was exactly as I had left it that morning, the throw blanket folded over the arm of the sofa, the lamp casting a soft, steady light across the coffee table where a single unopened letter sat, its corner slightly lifted as if it had been disturbed by a passing draft. I walked over to it slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because I already knew what it was, and I picked it up with the same calm I had carried all evening. The envelope bore Daniel's handwriting, careful but unfamiliar, like someone trying to imitate a version of himself that no longer existed. And for a moment, I traced the letters of my name with my thumb, remembering a time when he would write it on birthday cards with uneven lines and too much pressure, proud of each letter as if it were something he had built from scratch. I opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside, reading the words once, then again, not because they were complicated, but because they confirmed what I had already understood. It was polite, almost formal, explaining that it might be best if I gave them space for a while, that tensions had been building, that certain arrangements needed to be respected, phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried a distance that had not been there before, and nowhere in the letter did he mention the dinner, the moment that had just passed, as if it had already been accounted for, already justified in a conversation I had not been invited to. I folded the letter carefully and set it back on the table, not out of respect for its contents, but out of respect for myself, because reacting to it would not change anything that had already been set in motion. I moved toward the hallway and paused by the small cabinet where I kept important documents, the ones that had once been shared, accessible, open to discussion, and I opened it without hesitation, reaching for the folder I had reorganized earlier that day, the one that now contained updated papers, new signatures, decisions that could not be undone with a phone call or a change of heart. I placed the folder on the table and opened it, not to review, but to acknowledge, flipping through each page with a steady rhythm, seeing my name where it needed to be, seeing the absence of others where it no longer belonged, and I felt no anger, no urgency, only a quiet sense of completion, as if a long and complicated equation had finally balanced. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it for a moment, grounding myself in the reality of what I had done, and then I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness except for the faint light from the hallway, because I did not need to keep anything illuminated anymore, not for them, not for explanations, not for reconsideration, only for myself. And I knew with a clarity that did not waver that whatever they believed they had secured tonight, whatever control they thought they had claimed, it no longer existed in the way they imagined, because it had already been moved, already been protected, already been placed beyond the reach of anyone who had mistaken my silence for weakness. I did not sleep much that night, not because my mind was restless, but because it had finally become still in a way I was not used to, as if something that had been quietly turning in the background for years had come to a complete stop, leaving behind a silence that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. I lay there for a while, watching the faint outline of the ceiling as the first hint of morning light began to press through the curtains, and I realized that I was not replaying the evening the way I might have once done, not questioning what I could have said differently, not wondering if there had been a moment I could have changed the outcome, because deep down, I knew there had not been. This had been building long before a single word was spoken at that table. When I finally got up, I moved through the house with a quiet sense of purpose, making coffee the same way I always did, measuring carefully, waiting for the slow drip to fill the pot, pouring it into my favorite mug without rushing, because there was no longer anything I needed to hurry toward or avoid. I carried the mug to the window and stood there, looking out at the street as it began to come to life. Neighbors leaving for work, a car engine starting, a dog being walked along the sidewalk, all of it continuing exactly as it should, unaffected by what had shifted in my world, and that, strangely, brought me comfort. I took a sip and let the warmth settle, grounding me in the present, and then I turned back toward the table where the folder still rested, exactly where I had left it, untouched, certain. I walked over and opened it again, not out of doubt, but out of acknowledgement, letting my eyes move over the pages one by one. The updated will, the transfer of property, the accounts that had been reassigned, each line precise, each decision intentional, nothing left open to interpretation, nothing left for someone else to quietly redirect behind my back. I remembered the conversation from the day before, the calm explanation that once these changes were processed, access would be limited, authority clearly defined, and I had understood then what that meant, not just in legal terms, but in something deeper, something that went beyond documents and signatures. It meant that the control I had once shared out of trust was now placed firmly back where it belonged. I closed the folder and placed it neatly back into the cabinet, locking it with a small, deliberate motion, the click soft but final, and for a moment I rested my hand against the wood, feeling the solidity of it, the certainty. There was no anger in me as I stood there, no desire to confront, no need to call or explain or demand anything in return, because what needed to be said had already been answered in actions, not words. I returned to the kitchen, rinsed my cup, and set it in the sink, then dried my hands slowly, taking in the quiet order of the space around me, the familiarity of it, the life I had built piece by piece without expecting anything in return except respect. And now that respect had been withdrawn, not by me, but by them. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen for a moment, noticing there were no messages, no missed calls, nothing to suggest that anyone from that table had reconsidered or reached out. And I did not find that surprising, because people who believe they are in control rarely question their own actions so quickly. I set the phone back down and allowed myself a small breath, steady and unforced, because I knew something they did not, something they would only begin to understand later, when the assumptions they had built their plans around no longer held true, when access became questions, when expectations turned into silence. And by then, there would be nothing left for me to clarify, nothing left to give. Only the quiet certainty that I had already stepped beyond the reach of everything they thought they could take. The call came later than I expected, just after noon, when the day had already settled into its quiet rhythm and the house felt steady again. And I let it ring twice before picking it up, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to meet it with the same calm I had carried through everything else. I recognized Daniel's number immediately, the familiar pattern of digits that once meant simple conversations, quick check-ins, plans for Sunday dinners. But now it felt different, like something reaching across a distance that had already been established. I answered without speaking first, allowing the silence to stretch just enough for him to fill it. And when he did, his voice carried a tone I had not heard in a long time. Not warmth, not quite concern, but something closer to confusion, as if the script he had expected to follow was no longer working. He asked if I had made it home safely, the question polite, almost careful, and I replied that I had, my voice even, unchanged, offering nothing more than what was asked, because anything beyond that would have belonged to a different version of us, one that no longer existed. There was a pause on the other end, a longer one this time, and I could almost hear him searching for the next line, something to regain control of the conversation, something to bring things back into a space he understood. And then he mentioned the house, casually at first, as if it were just another topic, asking if I had thought about what we discussed last week, about making things easier, about simplifying arrangements, phrases that now sounded hollow, stripped of the certainty they once carried. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting his words settle without interrupting, and I realized that this was the moment where everything would begin to shift for him, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, undeniable ways that would slowly reshape what he believed to be true. I told him that I had taken care of everything, keeping my tone steady, almost reassuring, and for a brief second, there was relief in his silence, as if he assumed that meant agreement, compliance, a continuation of what he had expected. But that relief did not last long. He asked what I meant, his voice tightening just slightly, and I repeated myself, choosing each word with care, explaining that all the necessary changes had already been made, that everything was now clearly arranged, properly documented, and no longer open to adjustment. Another pause followed, heavier this time, and I could feel the shift even through the distance of the call, the moment where understanding begins to replace assumption, where certainty starts to fracture. He asked for details then, more directly, no longer circling around the subject, and I told him that he would receive all the information he needed in due time, that everything had been handled through the proper channels, leaving no room for confusion or reinterpretation. I did not raise my voice, did not add emotion, did not offer explanation beyond what was necessary, because this was not a conversation meant to persuade or defend. It was simply a statement of fact. On the other end, his breathing changed, slower, more deliberate, as if he were trying to steady himself within a reality that no longer matched his expectations. And for the first time, I sensed something else beneath his words, something quieter, less certain, but I did not reach for it, did not try to define it, because it was not mine to carry anymore. I told him I had things to do and that we could speak another time, ending the call gently, without finality, without anger, just a clean, quiet conclusion. And as I set the phone down, I understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they planned at that table, but by what they had failed to see before it was already too late. The next few days passed with a kind of quiet precision, each hour unfolding without interruption, as if the world had agreed to give me space to settle into what I had already set in motion, and I moved through them without urgency, without waiting for anything to happen, because I knew that when change finally reached them, it would not arrive as a single moment, but as a series of small realizations that could not be undone. I spent that time attending to things I had long postponed, sorting through old drawers, organizing papers that no longer needed to be shared, placing memories into boxes not out of sadness, but out of clarity, deciding what belonged to me and what had only ever been held for others. The house felt lighter with each small adjustment, not emptier, just more defined, as if its purpose had shifted along with mine. On the third morning, the first sign came, not as a call, but as a message, brief and direct, from Daniel, asking if I had time to talk. The words carefully chosen, but carrying a tension that had not been there before. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding immediately, not to create distance, but because I no longer felt the need to respond on anyone else's timeline. When I did call him back later that afternoon, his voice was different, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but edged with something sharper, something closer to urgency. He mentioned the accounts first, saying there seemed to be an issue, that access had changed, that information was missing, and I listened without interrupting, allowing him to move through his explanation, because I recognized the pattern, the gradual shift from assumption to confusion, from confusion to concern. I told him there was no issue, only an update, my words steady, unhurried, and there was a pause before he asked what kind of update, the question no longer casual, no longer framed as a suggestion, but as a demand for clarity. I explained that everything had been reviewed and adjusted to reflect current realities, that ownership and authority had been clearly reassigned, that what once had been shared informally was now defined formally, leaving no room for interpretation, and as I spoke, I could feel the weight of each sentence settle on the other end of the line. He asked if Ashley knew about this, and I answered truthfully that there was nothing to inform, because the decisions I made did not require approval, only execution, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, not the changes themselves, but the realization that they had occurred without his involvement. His tone shifted again then, less controlled, more direct, asking why I would do something like this without discussing it with them, and I allowed a small silence before responding, not out of hesitation, but to ensure that what I said would not carry emotion, only clarity. I told him that discussions require mutual respect, and that respect had already been withdrawn, not by me, but by the choices made in front of others, in moments that could not be undone or reinterpreted later. There was no raised voice, no accusation, just a simple statement placed between us, and for a long second, he did not respond at all. When he finally spoke again, there was something different beneath his words, something less certain, as if the ground he had been standing on was no longer as stable as he believed, and I understood then that this was only the beginning, not of conflict, but of recognition, the slow unfolding of consequences that had already been set in place long before they realized they would have to face them. A week passed before I saw them again, not by accident, but not entirely planned either. One of those moments where paths cross because they were always going to, regardless of what had happened before, and it was at the same place they had once assumed I would always return to without question, the house that had held every holiday, every gathering, every quiet Sunday afternoon that now felt like something distant and carefully archived rather than lived. I arrived early, as I always had, but this time I did not go inside right away, instead standing by the front walkway, noticing the small details that had once gone unquestioned, the way the curtains were drawn differently, the faint marks near the door where something had been moved, subtle changes that spoke louder now than they ever had before. When the door finally opened, it was Daniel who stood there, not Ashley, and for a brief moment, he looked unsure of what to say, as if he had rehearsed something that no longer fit the situation he was facing. I greeted him simply, my tone even, neither warm nor cold, and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, not out of defiance, but because I no longer needed permission to enter a space that had once been built on my presence. Ashley was in the living room, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged, but there was a tension beneath it now, something less certain than before, something that had been introduced by questions she could not easily answer. No one mentioned the restaurant, not directly, but it lingered in the room like something unfinished, something that had changed the way we all understood each other. Daniel began to speak first, his words measured, explaining that there had been confusion, that things had escalated, that perhaps everything could be clarified if we just sat down and talked through it, the kind of language that suggested resolution without acknowledging cause, and I listened without interrupting, allowing him to complete the version of events he was trying to construct. When he finished, the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not strained, just clear, and I realized that this was the moment they expected something from me, an opening, a reconsideration, a willingness to restore what had been disrupted, but I had already moved beyond that point. I took a slow breath and looked around the room, at the furniture I had chosen, the arrangement I had once cared about, the space that had been shaped by years of quiet effort, and I understood that it no longer held the same meaning, not because it had changed, but because I had. I told them, calmly and without emphasis, that there was nothing left to clarify, that everything had already been decided, documented, and set into motion, and that what they were experiencing now was not confusion, but the result of those decisions becoming visible. Ashley's expression shifted then, just slightly, the composure giving way to something sharper, something closer to realization, and Daniel asked what that meant for them. The question direct now, stripped of pretense, and I answered with the same steady clarity I had carried from the beginning, that it meant exactly what had been outlined, that access, control, and expectations had been redefined, not as a reaction, but as a correction. There was no anger in my voice, no need to emphasize the past, because it no longer held any power over what had already been secured. I reached for my purse, holding it lightly at my side, and allowed myself one final look at both of them, not searching for regret, not measuring their response, just acknowledging that whatever we had once been to each other had already shifted into something else, something that no longer required my presence to sustain it. And as I turned to leave, I understood with a quiet certainty that the moment they chose to diminish me in front of others was the same moment they unknowingly released everything they believed they were entitled to. And by the time they recognized what had truly changed, it would no longer be within their reach to undo it.